In this demonstration, I'll be working with PowerShell to create and associate an elastic IP address or an EIP. Now, you know you need to use an EIP when you've got a workload, for example, running within an EC2 instance, and you need it to maintain or to keep the same public IPv4 address. Sometimes, when an IP address changes, such as for an EC2 instance when you restart it can cause problems with connectivity because you always have to track the new public IP address and specify that you want to connect to that. That's if you're connecting by IP. If you're using DNS, you then have to make sure you have DNS records that are always kept up to date with the new IPv4 address associated with the given DNS record, like an A record. So let's go into PowerShell and let's work with elastic IP addresses. So here in PowerShell, I'm just going to run get-module-list asterisk AWS asterisk for wildcard characters, and it returns back that AWS PowerShell indeed is available on this computer. Okay, that's great. Clear screen with CLS. Now I'll run get-AWS credential-list profile detail. What I'm doing with this is seeing if there are any existing saved credentials that we can call upon to authenticate to our AWS account. Okay, so we've got a profile here called admin1, which I'm going to use. Initialize -AWS default configuration -profile name admin1. Okay, that's it. We're done. That profile has the access key and the secret key that have been retained, and so now I am in. For example, if I issue get-s3 bucket, it will show me the buckets that I have available. So it proves that we are authenticated. So I'll clear the screen and I'm going to run new-ec2 address. This is going to allocate a new elastic IP address resource. And what I want to do is take note of a few things. First of all, it's in US East 1, and of course the public IP itself is 44.206.220.204, and that's a public IP address on the internet that stems from Amazon's allocated pool of public IPs. Of course, we also have the allocation ID at the top, which I will select and copy by pressing Control-C, because I'm going to need that soon at the command line. If I were to run get-ec2 address to retrieve a list of elastic IPs, all of the elastic IPs that are tied to my account will be shown here. So we've got a few of them shown here, but the one that we've just allocated is actually listed here at the very bottom. Again, it starts with 44.206. Now, if you really want to, I'll just use the up arrow key to get back to get-ec2 address. You can specify region with -region, let's say US-East-2, to show elastic IPs in a given region. Notice that we get nothing. The default is the region you're currently working in, which is part of your profile in PowerShell. If I specify US-East-1 as the region, well, there's my elastic IP. So they are region specific, like many resources are in AWS, except for some things like S3 buckets, which are global. All right, the next thing I want to do is I want to tag that. So I can do that with new-ec2 tag -resource ID, and I'll paste in here my allocation ID for that public IP address, that elastic public IP. Then I use -tag at open curly brace key equals and in double quotes name semicolon value equals and in double quotes. Let's say EIP2 because I already have a resource named EIP1, and I'll press enter. Okay, so if I use the up arrow key to go back to get my EC2 addresses, our elastic IP is now showing with a tag for name, tag's name. So back here in the console, if I were to go to the EC2 management console, and on the left, if I were to scroll all the way down under network and security and then click on elastic IPs on the left, there's EIP2 and it starts with 44.206. So it's been created and it's been tagged or named. Of course, if I select it here in the GUI, I could go to actions and associate it with an instance or a network interface, but we're going to complete that at the command line. So to associate an elastic IP, now I want to associate my elastic IP with an EC2 instance, and I can do that with the register -ec2 address PowerShell commandlet. So I'm using the -instance ID parameter and I'm giving it the value, which is the ID of the instance I want to associate the Elastic IP with. Then I'm using -allocation ID, and here I've pasted in the allocation ID that we saw and copied when we first created our Elastic IP. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter. And it returns an association ID. Now back here in the EC2 management console, specifically in the instances view, I'm just going to click refresh. And if I were to go into one of my instances, specifically the one I just associated the EIP with, notice for public IPv4 address, indeed, it starts with 44.206, and in parentheses, because we tagged it, it shows as EIP2. And I could actually click directly on that link, which takes me to the Elastic IP address resource that we created. And here's the associated instance ID and the private IP address for that instance. I'm going to copy that association ID from here, because here in PowerShell, I'm going to use that to unregister or disassociate that Elastic IP from that instance. So I'm using the unregister-ec2 address PowerShell commandlet. Then I'm using the -association ID parameter, and the value is the association ID, and I'll press enter. So now that Elastic IP is no longer associated with that instance. Let's check our work. So back in my instances view, if I go back into that same instance's details, it's got a public IPv4 address. So that must come, of course, from the subnet settings where it was launched, but it is not an Elastic IP. That means it will change every time you restart the VM. And we also don't see EIP2 in parentheses any longer. But the other thing to bear in mind is you don't want these hanging around. You don't want Elastic IPs that aren't associated with anything, because you're still paying for their use. You could either select it here in the GUI and then go to Actions, Release, because it's already been disassociated or unregistered from the instance. But we're going to do it from the command line. Let's delete EIP2 from the command line. For that, we'll need the allocation ID. I'll copy it from here. We can also copy it from various other command line results. To do that, I'll use the remove-ec2 address commandlet with -allocation ID. Here is the allocation ID, and I can also pass it -force. I don't really need that since it wasn't associated with an instance. And now back here in the console, if I go to the Elastic IPs view and click the refresh button at the top, we no longer have EIP2.